The fabulous Dorothy E. Roberts. Yeah. I have to honestly say, when she wrote Killing the Black Body, I was mad at her. Because she wrote the book I wanted to write, you know? But it is foundational to us understanding not only how oppression and reproductive oppression happened to black women, but what we did in resistance to it as well. And so it's one of those seminal books. I don't know anybody that can teach a reproductive justice class without teaching Dorothy Roberts. It's the first thing I have all my students read anyway. So Dorothy is an American sociologist, law professor, and social justice advocate. She is the Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, the George A. Weiss University Professor, and the inaugural Raymond Pace and Saney Tainer Mossel Alexander. Damn, how many titles did they give you, girl? All of this is at the University of Pennsylvania. But anyway, I'd like to bring up Dorothy Roberts. Please welcome her. She's going to get a full hour to talk to us. Let me get out the way.
Just sit right back where you were. Okay. Okay. Well, greetings, everybody. Good morning. Thank you all for getting up so early. Only for Loretta would I do this. And thanks for that huh? Oh, the mic. Thanks for that introduction.
Closer.
Closer even. Okay. All right. Okay. It's so great to be here to see so many people. I think some of you I haven't seen for 20 years or so. And oh, is this better?
No, just in case so you don't have to hold it for an hour.
Oh, okay. It's on too?
I don't know about that. Oh,
Let's
no.
see. No. Okay. What do I? Oh, should I switch them?
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna get this together.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Oh, Tony, hi.
Somebody just read the game.
This is a great reunion here. All right. So, uh, Loretta asked me to talk about my book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And it's kind of unusual because usually when I speak at reproductive justice gatherings, I'm talking about killing the black body. Or more recently, I'm talking about my books on abolishing family policing, Shattered Bonds, or my most recent book, Torn Apart. And in fact, when I wrote Fatal Invention, which was published in 2011, a lot of people in the reproductive justice community were surprised that I would write a book on that topic. So the book is about the resurgence of biological concepts of race in science, especially genetic and genomic science, and why we saw this resurgence and what was so alarming about it. And a lot of people said, well, why are you writing about that? What does that have to do with reproductive justice? Why are you writing about science, about genetics? I think, as many people here have noted in talks that they already gave, and we'll talk about more, we're seeing more clearly today the connections between the the kinds of ideas, eugenicist ideas and white supremacist ideas in genomic science. But at the time, it wasn't that obvious. Of course, today we're seeing so many connections. I feel like we now see connections about things I've been writing about, for almost 40 years, between the bans on abortion, compelled pregnancy and birth, criminalization of pregnancy, family policing, genetic and genomic science. These are the what I've been writing about in separate books, and a lot of times people said, well, what's the connection here? And I think now, especially after the Dobbs decision and the administration we have now, and the federal administration, we can see these connections. So that's something I hope to talk about. I'm going to talk about fatal invention, but throughout, I want us to think about the connections to RJ of these biological eugenicist ideas about race, and also how they link to those ideas about disability and gender and class. I'm going to be talking about race, but it's all very much connected, as Black feminists have been saying from the beginning. It's all connected. So uh, I wrote this book because after the human genome was mapped, and all the scientists that led the Human Genome Project reported that it showed that race was not real at the genetic level, that there is no such thing as genetically distinct races. Races, the human race did not evolve into separate races. And many of us thought this would be the end of the notion that the human species is naturally divided into races. But just the opposite happened. So, the map of the human genome, the first draft was revealed in June of 2000. And President Bill Clinton, for example, said this shows that all human beings, regardless of race, he still used race in his statement, are 99.9% the same. But of course, the response was, oh, yeah, but there's so much human genetic variation within that 0.1%, and that's broken down by race. That was the response of many scientists. And then I started reading in the New York Times, Nicholas Wade, who was the chief scientific journalist for the New York Times, which is supposed to be the paper of record for the world, started publishing articles on the front page predicting that the next phase of genetic research was, and I have here, was the genetic differences between human races. This is on the front page of the New York Times on July 20th, 2001. And then he started publishing these articles that there were three principal human races: Europeans, Africans, and Asians, and they differed physically. And then he wrote a book saying they differed socially as well. And that's why white people had democracy and Asian people had dictatorships, and Africans were left behind and were just tribal. He wrote a whole book about this. At one point, it was a bestseller, like the Bell Curve. And then what happened? I'm going to try not to tell too many stories because I'll get overtime. But then I was at Northwestern at the time, and every year they had this medical school had the Silverstein lectures, and they invited the cutting edge scientists. So they invited Jonathan Entine, who'd written a book called Taboo about why Black people are good at sports, but if we're afraid to say it. That's who they invited to give the lecture. I'm not making this up. And then at the end of the lecture, and he went into, his Ashkenazi Jewish background, and the only way that his family could understand the illnesses that it had was through genetic research. And this showed that it was important to study race and genetics to be able to cure diseases. And then he said, and if you don't believe me, I am going to show you that the preeminent anthropologist in the United States believes this too. I'm thinking, who the heck is he talking about? And the screen came down in this big auditorium at Feinberg School of Medicine, at Northwestern, and it was Chris Rock. It was Chris Rock. Chris Rock was going around interviewing boxers and asking, why can't white men box? That's what he showed. And then afterward, all these people are flooding up to him. Oh, Mr. Entine, this is brilliant. And I'm like, oh, my God, this is horrible. What is going on here? I want to investigate this. I want to write a book about this because I thought it was extremely dangerous that there was this resurgence of this idea that race is a natural division of human beings. And as I started looking at, and I'm thinking, is Nicholas Wade right? Is this really going on? He was citing scientific articles in the New York Times. And I began to read the scientific articles, and sure enough, and this was documented as well, at that period, there was an increase in genetic research and scholarly articles on the genetic differences between races. So I started to read these definitions of race, like the one in the Pharmacogenomics Journal in 2010, defining races as population clusters based on genetic differences due to evolutionary pressure. So the idea was that after human beings evolved, and mostly on the continent of Africa, and then left, that they left and went onto separate continents and evolved separately into these separate races. But this is a popular idea, even though if you just think about it for a minute, it makes absolutely no sense. When did this happen? Why was it that they couldn't meet each other? What were these divisions that they would evolve separately? What were the conditions that would create these separate? Anyway, makes no sense, but it was very popular. So in Fatal Invention, I just documented that there was this resurgence of scientific research defining race as a genetic grouping. And I won't go into all the details, but some of the scientists had computer programs they did to try to prove it, and these evolutionary theories, all of it that made no sense, but they were trying to explain all sorts of health inequities as based in genetic difference. And my thesis was that at the time Barack Obama was president, and there was this idea that because he had become president, we were living in a raceless society, racism was over. And so I argued that these were now explanations for why there was still so much obvious racial inequality in America. We still had massive differences in wealth, in income, in housing, in incarceration, every single aspect of life in America clearly defined by white supremacy and racism. So, how could you say that? And the explanation was, well, it's because of these innate genetic differences that we're seeing these social differences. And then I also pointed out that big business was behind it because there were commercial advantages to selling pharmaceuticals and other therapies based on race. So if you say that people of different races have different diseases, you need to treat their diseases differently, you can market. It actually is commercially profitable to market drugs by race. And in fact, the FDA did approve the first race-specific drug for Bidil for heart failure. So uh, just to uh, give a little background on this, the race, we can historically see when and how race was invented. And I started to use the word invention. I put invention in the title of my book because people had heard the term race is socially constructed, and a lot of students were learning that. But it's very easy to say race is socially constructed, but it's still biological. In other words, it's a natural biological division of human beings in their genes, that human beings evolved into separate races, but it's socially constructed because it's interpreted differently in different societies. So saying race is socially constructed for many people does not negate for them the biological concept of race. Now I wanted to, what can I say to make it clear that this is made up. So I said it's invented. It's a political system that is invented. It was invented originally by Europeans who wanted to have a theological defense of enslaving, conquering, exterminating people. And so it actually began in Christian theology that God divided human beings into races. God created white people first in God's image, and then divided all other human beings. Some believed these were separate creations. And so uh, you know, that's why the idea of biological race is a creationist idea. You have to believe that some force of nature, whether it's God, nature, evolution, whatever, created the races. It's a backward creationist idea, but again, it's rooted in a Christian defense of slavery. And then the Enlightenment scientists simply adopted that idea. They just said nature created the races. And then, of course, they put it in a hierarchy. And some people say, well, I believe race is biological, but I don't think it's in a hierarchy. Well, show me wherever, anytime, race has been seen as a natural division of human beings and it wasn't put in a hierarchy. And it's usually white people as superior, and then black people as the most inferior, and then indigenous people and from the Americas and Asians put somewhere in between, and they're lumped into groups, something like that. This is like hundreds of years old, and yet you can find NIH supported grants that don't. Oh, now they're going to stop funding the ones that say let's look at the social reasons for health inequities, but believe me, genetic reasons, that'll be fine. We'll see. They're ending the funding for equity. Is now, you can't put that in your proposal. You won't get funded. All right, so for example, Thomas Jefferson wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia that the reason why black people couldn't be part of this democracy he was creating, that was supposed to be based on the equality of all men and the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was because of, quote, the real distinctions nature hath made. It's all because of nature. And this, of course, as I said, this way of thinking is the basis for eugenics. That eugenics explains social inequalities, whether based on class. That was the original Francis Galton. The privileged class of English. The English were that way because they inherited genius. That's what he said. So when President Trump says that the reason why the plane crashed into the helicopter was because of DEI and we need people with genius, that's the word he used. That's why, Loretta, when they say MacArthur genius, I don't like it, because that word genius, that was Francis Galton's word. And he said the rich people in England were rich because they inherited genius, and the people who were impoverished and working class didn't inherit it. So whether we're talking about gender or race or class or disability, it's all an explanation of inequality based in some natural division of people. And that's what race is. That's what race is. That it's an invented division of human beings to explain away white supremacy. Now, a really important aspect of that, the invention of race, was the idea that black women reproduced black race and the disadvantages connected to it in their bodies. And this idea was foundational to law in the colonies, because in the 1600s, before the idea of race was fully cemented into US society, of course, it became then the fundamental foundation of US society and fundamental foundation of the idea that black people were innately supposed to be enslaved and white people were innately supposed to be enslavers. That idea that connects race and slavery, which is a new concept, a new concept in the 1600s. And the US was for eugenics and the connection between race and slavery, racial slavery, racial capitalism, all of that was perfected in the United States. But one important aspect of it was the question that came up to the white elite in Virginia and other colonies, what is the status of children born to black women who were fathered by white men? And of course, these were all children who were the result of white men raping black women. And the question came up, what is the status of their children? They're the children of white men. How can you enslave the child of a white man? Well, of course, they wanted to be able to enslave these children. So the question was easily answered. The children have the status of their mothers. That way, white men could profit from raping black women. They didn't have to worry about these children claiming the privileges of whiteness. You could clearly then say there is this privileged white class of people, race of people, who are naturally entitled to power and privilege. And unless you're pure white, you don't get those privileges. You know, that's what what does white mean? It means that people have the privilege of whiteness. And then the rules tell you who fits into that. That's why we know it's made up. Because how do you know who's white? You only know by the definition. How do you know who's black or Asian or native? You know, it's the definition. So you have opposite definitions. Black people are people of any discernible African ancestry. White people are people who only have European ancestry. Okay, that's obviously not a scientific definition because it's the opposite. But but let me just emphasize 2 points. By saying that children born to black women have the status of their mothers, it did 2 things. One, it said that race is reproduced. It's natural. You're born into a race. Actually, you're conceived into a race because enslavers already legally owned the fetuses of black women from the moment of conception. So you were conceived into a race, and that reinforced the idea that race is biological. It's reproduced in women's bodies. But black race in particular is reproduced in black women's bodies because a black woman can only have a black child. Black women can only have a black child. Any child born to a black woman is black. That also meant, though, that it wasn't just their race, it was their status that they could be enslaved, which meant that the enslaved status of black children was produced by their mothers. Do you see how deep that, like, to me, this is the deepest law that set the stage for the entanglement of patriarchy and white supremacy in America. The idea that race is produced through reproduction and the disadvantaged status of black children is reproduced in their mother's wombs. That message has been used to sterilize black women, that black women are the cause of the disadvantaged status of their children, so they should be sterilized. And of course, we had mass sterilization of black women in the United States. Also, the anti-abortion forces used it when they put up posters saying the most dangerous place for a black woman is in the womb, where they were saying that black women were committing genocide against their communities because they were having too many abortions. Okay, note that's the same message. To sterilize black women and to compel us to give birth is our wombs are dangerous for our children. It's the reason why black women's reproduction has been seen from the very beginning as an appropriate subject for regulation and intervention. And those interventions include sterilization. They include prosecutions of black women for being pregnant and using drugs. They include ending welfare because black women are having children just to get a welfare check. They include genetic testing to make sure that black women are having children. This is why genetic testing could very well be imposed on us to ensure that our children are, fit or that we don't have them at all, or that children somehow we can, people imagine this, erase blackness from the gene pool. It's why Black women are the most likely, along with Indigenous women, to have their children taken from them and their rights terminated, all based on this idea that I think started with this law in the 1600s, which was replicated in other colonies, that Black women reproduce the enslavable status of their children. Oh, I just want to read also, I wrote down a quote from the Houston Post in 1990. And I read this when I was working on my book, Killing the Black Body, and writing about how reproduction became a crime with the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. They had an op-ed in the Houston Post said, call them welfare babies, crack babies, or deficit babies. By whatever term, they constitute a new bio underclass of infants who are disadvantaged almost from the moment of conception. So it's like whatever you want to call Black children, welfare babies, crack babies, they're a bio underclass. They're innately disadvantaged. Why? Not because of white supremacy and structural racism, because of their mothers. Because of their mothers. So, and they said almost from the moment of conception. I think today people would think from the moment of conception, with all the fetal personhood going on. It's like what that judge in Alabama that said you can't destroy embryos because they're little people. So this idea that any harm to a fetus is a crime that extends all the way to the moment of conception and maybe even prior to that, which is so much of this regulation starts with regulating Black women, and then it expands once those precedents are set that the fetus is a person deserving of more rights than the pregnant person from the moment of conception or perhaps even before. So, anyone capable of pregnancy can be regulated. All right. At the time after the slavery era ended, we get into it. Okay, my watch just stopped, so somebody's gonna have to stop me at some point.
You got another 10 minutes.
Okay, all right, okay. Um, uh, Eugenics and Jim Crow and the biological concept of race were all being uh, developed and structured and cemented into ideology and practice at the same time. So you have this idea of the biological basis of race that predicts what people are supposed to be like. What is the point of race? What's the point of dividing people into race? It's to predict, it's a prediction tool. Yeah, I can predict how smart you are. I can predict or your intelligence. Or now I like to say today, your educational attainment, so they don't have to use the word intelligence. I can predict your character. I can predict whether you're going to commit a crime, all of these ideas based on your race. So you combine that with the eugenicist idea that we inherit socially valuable or unvaluable traits. That's what eugenics was all about, the prediction of who inherited good traits or bad traits, and then you do something about it. Encourage people who have the positive traits to have more children. You discourage or even prevent those who have negative traits from having children. Okay, you combine that with the biological concept of race, and then you combine it with the idea that there is an innate superiority of certain races because they're predicted to have inherited these traits, and inferiority of others. And again, in the United States, it's always been the prediction that white people have inherited these traits. And we now have a president who's literally said, I show my students a recording of all these clips. You can find it online of the president saying, I'm smart because I inherited my German genes. I'm a winner because of the genes I inherited. And again, you just if you listen to things he says, he has what they call the racehorse theory of reproduction. That if you combine two excellent racehorses, you're going to give birth to an excellent racehorse. And that's how he thinks about human beings. And these policies are being put into action, and we can see that there are people who have explicitly stated these eugenicist and racist ideas who are in the administration in various parts, making policies. Now, there are those who will explicitly say it, but still, most scientists who still want to practice racial science won't. It won't. They like to say we're not, but I'm not a racist. So that's the excuse for continuing this. It's kind of paradoxically at the end of World War II, when the Nazis, who adopted US eugenicist thinking, had exterminated millions of Jews and others, that we were supposed to end this kind of thinking in science. But what happened was that people would say, well, I'm not a Nazi, so I can do it. It was the ideological use of race for repressive purposes, like white nationalists and Nazis, but I'm a scientist who's using it for legitimate purposes, legitimate research. And so you get now research like the research, and maybe others will talk about this. I know some will talk about the polygenic risk scores to predict, the traits of embryos. That's already happening now. So, I mean, it's all made up, but they're doing it anyway, marketing it. And all this research on polygenic risk scores to predict educational attainment. And then they say, but we're not racist. We're doing this to benefit the genetically disadvantaged. All right. Again, I said, look at history. When has the prediction that someone is less intelligent or less capable in their genes, when has that ever helped that person? Never. It's always been the basis of even exterminating, getting rid of people like that. So, and it's being used as a claim to expand DNA databases so that, because this is supposed to benefit people, well, we don't have enough people of color DNA in these databases, so we need more. Okay, it's led to research that looks at the gross inequalities in health, like the racial differences in maternal mortality. And instead of asking what's the racism, both structural and individual biases that doctors have and others in the healthcare profession, asking questions like, and I'm reading a hypothesis here, Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk for extreme preterm birth and its frequency of recurrence. That was published in the leading journal of obstetrics and gynecology, a hypothesis that Black race, apart from all social factors, produces these bad outcomes for pregnant people and their children. And that got a headline in the New York Times. Study points to genetics in disparities in preterm births. We can see this also just more recently in the COVID pandemic, when Black people initially at least had higher rates of death, and immediately you saw articles coming out in scientific journals looking for some genetic reason why Black people were predisposed to this. The racial concept of disease that also was rooted in slavery and a justification for enslavement, that people of different races have different diseases and experience common diseases differently. That is the basis for race-specific medicine, but more widespread, what's called race correction, the idea that because people of different races have different types of bodies, that diagnostic tools should correct for race. Look at your lab test. You might have a test that says if you're black or African American, you get one number, non-black or non-African, a different number for kidney function, for example. And recently, only recently, people have started to ask, is this helpful or harmful? I mean, just like in the last 5 years, these studies are being done, finding that, and I'll just emphasize two that have to do with Black women. So, one common race correction is the equation to the calculator for feedbacks, whether you can have a vaginal birth after a C-section. And that has traditionally, it's being stopped in some places, corrected for race, which means that Black women are more likely to be told you cannot have a vaginal birth, which increases the rate of C-sections among Black women. And we know that there are risks for C-sections, right? And the United States has too many. Another was this study was just done in 2021. They looked at the use of race to diagnose anemia in pregnancy, based on the idea that Black women naturally have lower levels of iron. And so they were not being diagnosed with anemia during pregnancy. And the study found, well, that led to poor birth outcomes for Black patients. Do you really need a study to figure out that if you're. Anyway, those are just two examples of how race correction has harmed Black women in our reproductive lives. Also, multiple studies have shown that Black people are undertreated for pain.
Yes.
And including study finds treatment inequities for pain following C-section.
Yep.
You know, so Black women have reported, I was in pain, I was hemorrhaging, and no one did anything about it. Or the survivors have reported it after we've died from it. And Black women are at least 2 or 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. In some places, in New York City, New York Times anyway, reported recently that Black women are 9 times more likely to die than white women in New York City. Okay, I'm gonna move. So I want to end with some relevance in case it wasn't clear to reproductive justice. I've tried to give some examples of how reproduction and regulation of reproduction, thinking about reproduction, has been so central to the reproduction of the biological concept of race, how it intersects with the biological definitions of gender, biological definitions of citizenship, of class, of disability, that make structural inequities and discrimination seem to be natural. Therefore, we don't have to do anything about it. And, this administration, just to give an example, it's at the executive order that there are only 2 genders. Now, how did they defend that when obviously there aren't only 2 genders, male and female? They used a supposedly scientific definition looking at chromosomes. So again, the excuse that there's no gender inequality in America and there's only 2 genders, all of this explained by a natural definition of what the genders are, like the natural definition of what races are. There's also a carceral logic behind all of this. And I think it's important for reproductive justice activists to study and to, I would say, adopt abolitionist principles that see how so many of these systems are governed by a carceral logic, that inequality and people's unmet needs are caused by their innate deficits. and they're to be blamed for it. This cuts across everything I've been talking about. This was the explanation for prosecuting pregnant people for harms to the fetus. This is the explanation for what I call a family policing system that is usually called a child welfare system or child protective services. It has a carceral logic that says the harms to children are caused by their pathological parents, especially their mothers, with Black mothers as the emblem of the neglectful mother who has children not because she cares about them, but to get something for herself. And she's innately incapable of caring for these children, and they're better off anywhere but with her, even in a foster care system that we know is damaging, that has high rates of abuse, that locks up children in prison like settings, that traumatizes them. We know all these harms are well documented, but the idea is, well, but still the children are better off there than with their mothers. This is why the Adoption Safe Families Act could be passed, still in force now, that incentivizes terminating parental rights and putting children up for adoption. How did that pass? Signed by Bill Clinton and supported by Hillary Clinton, as protecting children. It was based on the idea that Black mothers were refusing to give up their rights to their children, and so their rights should be terminated to free their children. This is the terminology, is free their children. And then there were people like the Harvard professor Elizabeth Bartholet, who said they would be best off with white families, because the white families could teach them about how to have privileges in America. Like that would make a difference. So I'm going to end with these 2 points. One is to remember the basic tenets of reproductive justice, which are the human right not to have a child, the human right to have a child, therefore no punishing people for being pregnant or punishing them for risking a fetus, and the human right to parent your child in a sustainable, supportive community. No family policing either. And my most recent activist work has been around family policing. I think it's very much connected to the work we've all been doing. And I want to make a plug for including that and seeing the connections. I mean, think about it. What did the Amy Coney Barrett and Alito, in the opinion, what did they say was the answer to compelling people to be pregnant and give birth? Just put your child up for adoption. That was in the Dobbs decision. Put your child up for adoption. What's going to happen to these children? They're not, no, Alito said they can be guaranteed a wonderful home that they'll go to. And it'll solve the problem, the market-based problem. There are not enough adoptable children for the demand. Now, this is all in the opinion, the demand. There's not enough supply for the demand of adoptable children, literally in the Dobbs opinion. No, that's not what's going to happen. People who are forced to give birth to children they had decided they were not prepared for whatever reason to have are more likely to have their children taken from them. And the idea that a fetus is a person more important than the pregnant person, that's going to lead to more criminal. It's already happening. Pregnancy justice is already documented. The increase in punishment of pregnant people for some alleged harm to the fetus. So that's part of it. Then what happens when the baby is born? The newborn is taken away. We know this is extremely racist and harmful to children and to the people giving birth to them, to be traumatized like that. And then the other is an abolitionist way of thinking about how to approach this disastrous time we're in. That we have to abolish these systems that are rooted in oppression. And I mean that, the system, both ideological systems of eugenics and race, but also the actual physical systems like the family policing system and the prison industrial complex. and find solidarity with abolitionists who are working in these other areas. I'm really encouraged to see this room with people who are working in so many different parts of reproductive justice. I do find though that when I'm in a room with people who are working to abolish family policing, I don't always see the connections to people in the reproductive justice community, and I think and also in the prison abolitionist community. So I think those connections will, give us some hope and spirit, uplift our spirits as this is uplifting mine, and also give us a stronger movement to reimagine and put in place what is going to be our world when we bit by bit dismantle these oppressive ideologies and systems. So I will end there. Hope I did. Oh, we got time?